Hello and welcome to the London History Podcast. I'm Hazel Baker, historian, qualified London tour guide and director of londonguidedwalks.co.uk. And this is the show where we get down and dirty with the detail of London's past. The stuff that doesn't make it into the guidebooks, the stories hidden in plain sight. And today, episode 162, we're building a bridge. Now, I know what you're thinking. Tower Bridge? Surely everyone knows about Tower Bridge. It's on every tourist's photograph, every postcard, every tea towel in every gift shop from Paddington to Petticoat Lane. But I promise you, the real story of how Tower Bridge came to exist is far messier, far more political, and far more human than that. We're going to hear about the politicians who blocked it, the engineers who argued over it, the workers who died building it, and the critics who absolutely hated it. We'll be drawing on primary source newspaper reports from 1890, real Victorian voices, so strap in. This one is a proper deep dive. So let's start with the problem. By the early 1870s, London was the largest city in the world, and it was groaning under its own weight. The East End had exploded. Factories, docks, warehouses, and the people who worked in all of them. We're talking about roughly a third of London's entire population living east of the city. In fact, by 1883, the Thames Conservancy calculated that East London's population was comparable in size to Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and Leeds combined. That is staggering. And yet, if you lived or worked in the east of the city and you needed to cross the Thames on dry land, your nearest option was London Bridge, which was already heaving with carts, horses, pedestrians, and chaos. There was no other crossing downstream of London Bridge. None! The only alternative was a ferry. Between 1874 and 1885, approximately 30 petitions were submitted to the City of London. 30, all of them asking for either a new bridge or at least a widening of London Bridge. The riverside trades were screaming. The population was screaming. Something had to be done. Here's the catch, though, and this is what makes Tower Bridge so interesting as an engineering problem. The Pool of London, the stretch of river between London Bridge and the Tower, and there's a really fantastic film titled the same thing, this was one of the busiest stretches of commercial waterway in the world. Sailing ships, merchant vessels, coal barges, they all needed to get through. And sailing ships have tall masts. Any new bridge at that point in the river had to be able to open and let those ships through. That immediately ruled out a conventional fixed bridge at a low level. You couldn't just throw a span across and be done with it. The bridge had to move. And in the 1870s and 1880s, that was an extraordinary engineering challenge. So, the City of London set up a special bridge or subway committee in December 1875, and they started collecting designs. Over the following years, more than 50, that's 50 proposals were submitted. Some were brilliant. Some were bonkers. All of them were argued over furiously. One of the most prominent early proposals came from Sir Joseph Bazalgette. Yes, that Bazalgette. The man who built London's sewers and effectively saved the city from cholera. He proposed a high-level crossing, a bridge so far above the Thames that ships could sail underneath without the bridge needing to open at all. To reach it, you'd climb a long spiral ramp on the south bank. Now, Bazalgette was a genius, but this idea had a fatal flaw. Parliament rejected it. And here's where the politics gets complicated. The Metropolitan Board of Works, the predecessor to the London County Council, wanted to build the bridge and control it. The City of London Corporation wanted nothing to do with the MBW controlling a bridge on their doorstep. The Thames Conservancy Board, which managed the river, had its own objections. The ferry operators didn't want a bridge at all because it would destroy their livelihoods. The Governor of the Tower of London had concerns about a bridge so close to his fortress. Even Queen Victoria had reservations. This wasn't just an engineering project, it was a political battlefield. The committee eventually sent a delegation to Holland, Belgium, Newcastle, Edinburgh and Glasgow to look at working examples of movable bridges, including Bascule bridges in Rotterdam. They came back with recommendations. They narrowed it down to 3 options: 2 types of swing bridge and 1 Bascule design. In October 1884, the Court of Common Council voted. The Bascule won. And here's a name you should know: Horace Jones. He was the city architect, the man who also designed Billingsgate Market and Leadenhall Market, both of which are still standing. Jones had been working on Tower Bridge design for years, and his original sketch included an arch span between Gothic towers. It looked magnificent. But there was a problem. Ships' masts and rigging would catch on the arch. The arch had to go. Enter Sir John Wolfe Barry, the civil engineer who became Jones's partner on the project. It was Barry who solved the arch problem with what he called a level soffit, flat, high-level walkways connecting the towers. The walkways would still allow pedestrians to cross even when the bridge was raised, and the flat underside meant no snagging or rigging. It's a small detail, but it's the detail that made the whole design possible. Jones died in 1887, 2 years into construction, before he saw a single tower rise above the waterline. His colleague, George Stephenson, took over the architectural side and, interestingly, made the Gothic stonework even more elaborate than Jones had originally planned. The Corporation of London Tower Bridge Act received royal assent in August 1885, and it was extraordinarily specific about what the bridge had to do. The central opening span had to be at least 200 feet wide. When open, the bridge had to give 135 feet of clearance above Trinity High water. When closed, the road deck would sit 25 feet above the river. The piers had to be 185 feet long and 70 feet wide. The side spans, the suspension sections connecting the tower to the riverbanks, were to be 270 feet each. During construction, a clear waterway of at least 160 feet had to be maintained at all times so river traffic could continue. And here's the clause that I love. The bridge had to be open for river traffic at any time. Any time, a ship could demand the bridge to open at 3 a.m, and it had to open. The river took precedence over the road. And that tells you everything about the relative importance of river trade versus road transport in 1885. There was also a clause that allowed property owners to appeal for compensation if their property was depreciated by the works. This was specifically cited years later in a local vestry debate as a precedent for what they called worsenment, the opposite of betterment. So if a public improvement damages your property, you should be compensated. Tower Bridges Act was used as the test case. The Act originally required the bridge to be built within 4 years. A newspaper report from January 1890 noted dryly that despite the foundation stone having been laid in June 1886, with that 4-year promise, in 6 months' time, the bridge was still far from complete, with little but shapeless piles of iron, masonry and scaffolding visible. They needed a second act in 1889 to extend the deadline, and a third act in 1893 to extend it again. The bridge took 8 years in total. Right, let's get into the actual building. The work was divided into 8 separate contracts, which tells you something about the scale and the complexity of the job. Different contractors for their piers, the approaches, the machinery, the ironwork, the masonry, the paving, the lights. The lighting. It's essentially a small city's worth of construction compressed into one structure. The most fundamental and most dangerous job was contract number 1, sinking the 2 river piers. This went to a firm called John Jackson, and when I say most dangerous, I mean it. The piers had to be founded 60 feet below high water level, 60 feet, in the Thames, in the 1880s. The technique used was the caisson. The caisson is essentially a giant metal cage, open at the bottom, which you lower into the riverbed. You excavate the material inside the cage, gravel, clay, whatever the river bottom consists of, and the cage sinks progressively deeper under its own weight. You keep excavating until you hit solid clay at the required depth, and then you pump the water out and build your pier foundation inside that dry space. Now, February 1890, another newspaper report tells us that the 2 river piers of Jackson's contract number 1 had been completed. The report tells that the area covered by the piers was said to be larger than that of any other bridge pier in the world, covering no less than 16,500 superficial feet. Think about that. The largest bridge pier foundations in the world at that time, beneath the Thames, in London. The work had taken almost exactly 3 years longer than planned. Jackson reportedly completed the contract at only a small profit. The challenges of working in the Thames, the tides, the currents, the unexpected geology had eaten up time and money relentlessly. More than 70,000 long tons of concrete was sunk into the riverbed for those 2 piers. 70,000 tons in the river. I want to pause here and talk about 6 men because their story is one of the most extraordinary things about this project. Sinking those caissons required specialist divers to work underwater, inside the caissons doing the actual excavation of the riverbed. 6 men carried out this work from 1886 through to the completion of the piers. The names are friend Samuel Penny, John Bateman, Thomas Clarkus, Stephen Not Fry, James Rouse, and James Thacker. They are now commemorated on bronze plaques inside Tower Bridge itself. These men were extraordinarily well paid by Victorian standards. In 1886, a standard labourer earned 7 shillings a day. Hiring a diver, his diving team and the full equipment supplied by the specialist firm Sieb, Gorman & Co. cost 15 shillings a day. That's more than double. They were using surface-supplied diving suits, the Victorian hard hat diving apparatus with a copper helmet and a rubber suit and a lifeline connecting them to the surface. They descended into the caissons, which were partially flooded, and worked in extraordinarily challenging conditions, near zero visibility, strong currents, cold water, and the constant risk of equipment failure. The work took 3 years, 6 men. The entire foundation of one of the world's most famous bridges, laid by the hands of 6 people whose names most visitors have never heard of. If you visit Tower Bridge today, go and find those plaques. They deserve to be read. Once the piers were in, contract number 6 could begin, the iron and steel superstructure. This went to Sir William Arrol & Co. of Glasgow at a contract value of £337,113. That's the single largest contract of the 8, and William Arrol was no ordinary contractor. His firm had just finished building the 4th bridge. He was, at that moment, arguably the greatest bridge builder in the world. More than 11,000 long tons of steel went into the framework of the towers and the walkways. The bascules, the 2 opening sections of the road desk, were each built in the fully raised position and were first lowered together on 27th March 1894, just 3 months before the opening ceremony. Each bascule weighed approximately 1,070 tons, including its ballast and paving. The steel skeleton was then clad in Cornish granite and Portland stone, both to protect the ironwork from the corrosive Thames atmosphere and to meet the Act's requirement that the bridge harmonise with the nearby Tower of London. This is the detail that would later infuriate architectural critics, as we'll come to. It's worth mentioning here a tiny news story from the Building News in January 1890, which gives you a wonderful glimpse of the technological anxieties of the period. A firm in Leeds had developed a method of glazing stone before it was fixed to the building, at a low enough temperature not to damage the stone so that the building could be kept clean simply by rainfall. The idea was that London's notorious soot and smoke would just wash off a glazed surface rather than being absorbed. Tower Bridge's stone cladding would eventually require regular cleaning precisely because of the city's pollution. The Victorians knew it was coming, and we were already trying to solve it. Now, the mechanism. Being the daughter of an engineer, this is the bit where I get genuinely excited because the engineering of Tower Bridge's original operating system is extraordinary. The challenge was this. Each bascule weighed over 1,000 tons. You needed to raise both of them smoothly, reliably, and relatively quickly. The target was 5 minutes for a full lift. Every single time a ship needed to pass. In the 1880s, you couldn't just press a button, you needed a power source, and the Victorians had the perfect one. Steam-driven hydraulic pressure. The bridge had its own engine rooms, one on each side of the river beneath the approach roads. Inside, Lancashire boilers burned coal and produced steam around £85 per square inch. 2 boilers were always running, 2 kept in reserve. The steam drove horizontal pumping engines, which forced water up to an extraordinary pressure, £750 per square inch. That pressurised water was then stored in 6 massive hydraulic accumulators. Imagine a giant vertical cylinder with a weighted ram sitting inside it, pressing down. The pressurised water holds the ram up against gravity. When you need power, you open the valve, and that stored pressure, like a coiled spring, is released in a controlled burst. The accumulators acted as mechanical batteries, smoothing out the demand so the engines didn't have to work all in sudden surges. The system was invented and patented by Sir William Armstrong, the same Armstrong of Armstrong Mitchell, who had the hydraulic contract for the bridge. From the accumulators, high-pressure water flowed to 8 hydraulic engines, 4 per tower, which turned large-toothed cogs, engaging racks attached to the rear of each bascule. Turning the cogs raised the bascules. Simple in principle, phenomenal in execution. The whole system was designed by Hamilton Owen Rendell for Armstrong's firm, and it was built to the highest possible safety standards, explicitly described as equal to twice the requirements of the Board of Trade. This was 1894, just 15 years after the Tay Bridge disaster, when a catastrophic failure of cast iron in a storm had sent a passenger train plunging into the Firth of Tay, killing everyone on board. Victorian engineers were not cavalier about safety. They were very aware of what a structural failure could mean. The system was so robust that you only needed 1 steam engine and 2 hydraulic engines to raise the bridge. Everything else was redundant. In the first year of operation alone, the bascules were raised 6,160 times. Average, 17 times a day. That's a lot of ships. The steam hydraulic system ran essentially unchanged until 1974, when it was replaced by a modern electro-hydraulic drive. But the original Victorian machinery is still there, in the engine rooms beneath the South Approach, and you can visit it. It's one of the most spectacular pieces of Victorian engineering anywhere in London. Go and see it. Now let's talk money, because this is where the Victorian optimism really shows. Barry's original estimate for the whole project, everything including the land purchase, was £750,000. 4 years, £750,000. Straightforward, no? The accepted tenders for the building work alone came to £830,005. That's already 42% over the construction budget, and that's before a single unexpected problem had been encountered. The final direct construction cost was approximately £902,500. But if you look at the actual ledgers, tracing all the expenditure from 1885 right through to 1898, including compensation paid to wharf fingers and ferry operators, legal costs and ongoing work, the total comes to £1,640,714. That is more than double the original estimate, which would have been astonishing to the City of London Corporation, except that, well, it really wasn't that unusual for a major Victorian infrastructure project. In today's money, that total project is roughly the equivalent of £133 million. I can't tell this story honestly without talking about the human cost. During the 8.5 years of construction, 10 workmen were killed and 19 were badly injured. An inquiry found that 9 of the 10 fatalities were accidental. 1 was attributed to negligence by the deceased himself. 4 men died during the sinking of the foundations, the most dangerous phase, 1 on the approaches and 5 on the superstructure. At the time, these figures weren't considered shocking. Victorian construction sites had no health and safety executive, no hard hats, no fall arrest systems, no mandatory reporting. Men fell from scaffolding. Machinery crushed them. The era had a resigned acceptance of industrial risk. The first is Jackson v Leary, reported in the London Daily Chronicle, February 1890. The plaintiff was the bridge contractor John Jackson, who sued a licensed Thames pilot named Leary for damages caused when Leary's boat, the Albatross, struck the construction piles. The issue? Leary had brought his vessel out of St Catherine's Docks the wrong way, head foremost on a flood tide of 2 to 3 knots without the usual check ropes, instead of going stern foremost with check ropes at both quarters as procedure demanded. The result was that the boat was swept sideways and hit the piles. Mr. Justice Mayhew heard the case without a jury and found for the contractor. The damages were restricted by the Merchant Shipping Act to a maximum of £100, a fraction of the estimated £2,700 to £2,900 damage caused, plus £3 representing the pilotage fee earned on the occasion, with costs. A rather Pyrrhic victory for Jackson. The second case is the Admiralty Division judgment of the Othello versus the Albatross. Yes, a different Albatross, confusingly. Reported in the East End News in February 1890. Mr. Justice Butt heard this one without a jury. The barge Othello had been sunk in the upper pool in a collision with the steamer Albatross. There was an enormous conflict of evidence, large numbers of witnesses, contradictory accounts, disputed facts about which barge had actually been sunk, and the judge worked through it all meticulously. His conclusion is fascinating. He found that neither vessel had deliberately starboarded. Instead, he attributed the collision to the Albatross, allowing her to run off the tide, and specifically noted that there was an eddy there caused by the Tower Bridge works, which had disputed the normal tidal flow. The construction site itself had changed the river's behaviour. The ship hadn't been negligent in its usual sense, it had been caught out by an environmental change caused by the building of Tower Bridge. That is a remarkable finding. The bridge, still under construction, was already reshaping the legal landscape of the Thames. Here's something you might not know about Tower Bridge. When it opened, professional architects largely despised it. 2 months before the opening ceremony, the Pall Mall Gazette ran a satirical piece identifying Tower Bridge as London's ugliest structure. It called the bridge a huge but childish structure and lamented its ponderous horizontal masses of ironwork, innocent of any suggestion of arch. The most sustained attack came from Henry Heathcote Statham, editor of the journal Building. He called it the most monstrous and preposterous architectural sham we have ever known of, a discredit to the generation which has erected it. He later wrote that it represented the vice of tawdriness and pretentiousness and of falsification of the actual facts of the structure. The painter Frank Bramwin in 1920 declared, "A more absurd structure than Tower Bridge was never thrown across a strategic river." What all these critics objected to was a specific kind of Victorian dishonesty. Here was a steel structure built using the most advanced engineering of the age, dressed up in Gothic stonework as if it were a medieval castle. The stonework was a costume. The real bridge, the steel skeleton, the hydraulic machinery, the Bascule mechanism, was hidden beneath a theatrical facade. To architectural purists, this was fraudulent. The building was lying about what it was. The public disagreed entirely. Tower Bridge captured London's imagination almost immediately. By 1894, approximately 8,000 vehicles were crossing it daily, with 60,000 pedestrians using it every day. The New York Times would later call it, along with the Magna Carta and Alfred Hitchcock, one of the 3 uniquely valuable British institutions. The gap between professional critical opinion and popular affection could hardly have been wider. I find this debate genuinely interesting because it's a debate we're still having today about architecture. Is it dishonest to give a functional modern building a heritage facade? Or is it simply good urbanism, creating something that fits into its surroundings and means something to the people who use it? Tower Bridge raises these questions in their purest Victorian form. Tower Bridge was officially opened on 30th of June 1894 by Edward, Prince of Wales, later King Edward VII, and Alexandra, Princess of Wales. The ceremony was declared a semi-state occasion. The prince activated the bascules using a silver-gilt loving cup whose cover was connected to a switch, sending a signal to the engine rooms. The Home Secretary, H. Asquith, was in attendance, and so was Lord Carrington and the Lord Chamberlain. Here's a detail I love about this. Every single one of the approximately 1,200 workers who had worked on the bridge at some point during its 8-year construction was invited to the opening entertainment, and at the celebration dinner, each man received a commemorative pipe and a pack of tobacco. Each wife received a box of sweetmeats. A small gesture, a very Victorian gesture, but a gesture nonetheless. An acknowledgement that the bridge could not have been built without the men who laid the concrete, swung the steel, and dived beneath the Thames. 10 of those men hadn't lived to see the day. So there you have it. The real story of Tower Bridge, not just an iconic silhouette, but the product of 30 years of political wrangling, 50 rejected designs, 8 separate contracts, 6 extraordinary divers, 3 acts of parliament, a budget which more than doubled, 10 lives lost, and one of the most spectacular pieces of hydraulic engineering the Victorian world ever produced. Next time you cross it, or even just look at it, I hope you'll see something different. See the eddies the construction created that sank a Thames barge. See the Gothic stonework that made professional architects furious. See the bronze plaques to 6 men whose names deserve to be remembered. That's it for episode 162. Related episodes you might enjoy include episode 146, Jumping Tower Bridge, episode 137, The Thames Tunnel, episode 88, The World's First Underground Railway, or if you're more into the iconic London, then episode 59, Big Ben, might be the episode for you. Until next time, I'm Hazel Baker. Keep exploring.